Diablo 4 is actually pretty fun when it comes to testing builds and trying out new things. It's pretty often that I find myself enchanting my gear or trying out a different legendary aspect. But from all this testing, the gold reserves tend to get pretty low. And I don't know about you, but I find myself impulsively using my perfectly rolled legendary aspects on a piece of gear, and then finding out I got a better piece like an hour later. So I set off on a mission to figure out which was actually the best place to farm for legendaries and gold per hour, by directly comparing helltides, nightmare dungeons, and farming in the PvP zones. I see a lot of videos that claim a crazy amount of legendaries per hour, but they never took into account all the time in loading screens or selling your items and putting items back into your chest.
I am overburdened.
So I'm gonna spend 1 hour doing each of these activities in order to find out which is the best place to farm for gold and legendaries. I do want to mention that this was done on the seasonal servers, which means I did have the season's blessings on, which increased the amount of gold I would earn from vendor sales. But yeah, just wanted to maintain full transparency there. So let's start off with the most obvious choice, nightmare dungeons. And before I really get into the data, I just want to let you guys know exactly how I went through this experiment. What I wanted to accomplish was to basically know what would happen if I decide to log in Diablo 4 and casually do nightmare dungeons for an hour. So following that, what I did was I crafted a bunch of new sigils, and then I would only run those or any other sigils that I picked up along the way. That way I wouldn't make use of my stash of OP sigils, so I wouldn't skew the results. Now, deciding what tier of sigils I was gonna use was a little bit difficult. Since we're only going for legendaries and gold, I could have ran a lower tier sigil, but I thought I might as well run something that was around my level or a little bit higher, just cause I think that's what most people would be running, and that would still be decently efficient for glyph experience. And just to lower the amount of factors in the experiment, my plan was to pick up every single rare item, whether it be ancestral or sacred, and when I get back to town, I would immediately sell it without even looking at it. And as for legendary items, I would also just immediately deposit them in my chest, so I can tally them at the end of each hour. And one final thing, I just wanted to farm like I usually did when I would just turn off my brain and maybe have a video in the background to watch. I didn't want to do a hyper-focused 1 hour farm, because that's just not what I like to do, and I just wanted to know how the results would be if I were to do it as if I was doing it normally. And for the most part, I cleared 90% of the dungeons, but I would always skip things like events or cursed shrines and cursed wells. So these are the nightmare dungeons that I ended up running, and they were about 7 to 8 minutes per run, with the actual dungeon taking usually around 4 to 5 minutes, and all the loading screens, selling items, putting items back in your chest taking around 3 minutes. If you run your dungeons faster or your computer is not as bad as mine and loads a lot faster, then you should expect to see a lot more legendaries and gold per hour. And just a quick thing, I want to note that I did meet one treasure goblin during all of these runs and no butchers. So tallying these up, I got 27 legendaries throughout all the runs and 2 uniques. And after selling all the rares after each run, I netted around 7.2 million gold. I didn't end up selling the legendaries in this experiment because I did want to keep some at the end, but if you did, then you should expect a lot more gold in your total. Alright, so the next thing to test are helltides. I don't know how most people like to run helltides, but from my experience, I always tend to run the events as often as I can, since they provide a good amount of cinders and obols as well. So I will be including the obols in this experiment, in which in the end I'll gamble all the obols and tally those legendaries as well. And since there aren't really enough elite mob packs to farm, I usually just kill all the mob packs along the way. And of course, since helltides only last 1 hour, I made sure to wait it out until a new helltide started so I can make sure I make use of the full hour. So during the hour, I managed to farm 3 mystery chests and 8 other 75 cinder chests. I also didn't run into a single treasure goblin during this whole hour, which kinda sucked. But yeah. However, we do get a bonus of a bunch of obols from the events, and in total I got 627 obols. And since I decided to gamble for the focus, which was 40 obols, I got 15 gambles, in which I got a total of 6 legendaries from those gambles. And if I add that to the original tally of 19 legendaries, then that is a total of 25 legendaries, plus 1 unique. Now sadly for helltides, Since they lack a lot of elite mob packs, I didn't get a lot of rares, so the gold per hour was quite low at around 4.2 million gold for that whole hour. But of course, a bonus of the helltides are the crafting materials, and of course the fact that you can target farm specific pieces of gear. And now it's time to look at our third option, which are PvP zones, otherwise known as the Fields of Hatred. Now, farming in the PvP zones are definitely going to be the most inconsistent, just due to the fact that you could be farming at different times of the day where there's different amount of people farming alongside you, or of course, beating you up and stealing your lunch money. And just because of that, I decided to do 2 hours instead of just 1 hour in the PvP zones, one in Kyrgyzstan and one in the dry steppes. And for this experiment, I would only kill packs of elites, and then I would run to the next pack of elites, and I would skip anything else, including events. However, I would do the big boss in the zones if I had the chance, otherwise known as the Seething Abomination. Another big factor of the Fields of Hatred are the seed turn-ins that you can get, which you can use to gamble for gear, and potentially get a lot of legendary gear. So I decided to standardize and optimize my seed turn-ins by basically turning in seeds at the altar whenever my inventory was full. And that would mean I would have around 10 to 15,000 seeds. So my first hour was spent in the Kyrgyzstan PvP zone, which is by far considered the best PvP zone for farming, just because it has better mob density than the one in dry steppes. Now I got really lucky for this first hour because there was barely any PvP. I was farming at 10 AM on a Friday, which isn't peak hour but by no means a dead hour. There were a few players around, but they either minded their business or they're mainly just PvPing in the middle of the map, whereas I was just focused on farming, so they didn't really bother me. Another thing I was lucky with was that I managed to meet 2 treasure goblins, so that also helped with the total at the end as well. And during that hour, I also managed to kill 4 seething abominations. I did end up in a couple duels, I believe one against a Sork and one against a Druid, and I did win both, so I didn't lose any seeds during that hour. I ended up with 18 legendaries and 3 uniques. However, that still doesn't include any of the dust I got from the seed turn-ins, which was around 112,000. And that equates to 37 gambles in which I personally gambled for gloves. And from those gambles, I got 12 legendaries, making the total 30 legendaries for the hour. And after selling all the rares, I made around 7.4 million gold for that hour. But don't forget we're not done because I still had to farm one more hour in the dry steppes, in which I started the farm at 1 PM to 2 PM in the afternoon. The farm this time was a lot more chaotic because there was a lot more players that I met along the way, but I didn't die or lose any seeds. They just cut a lot more time from the grind. It's also worth noting that the PvP zone in the dry steppes is considered worse than the Kyrgyzstan zone because it has a lot less mob density. And finally, I did meet 1 treasure goblin and I ended up killing 5 seething abominations. So after the hour farming, I managed to get 15 legendaries, not including the ones I would get from gambling. And after turning in 93,000 seeds for red dust, I ended up gambling 31 times, which netted me a total of 11 legendaries. That would bump up the total to 26 legendaries. And for the gold, I made almost 6 million for the hour. And now we can finally compare all the results, in which the PvP zone and Kyrgyzstan actually came out on top technically. But that was under the most optimal conditions, which you aren't going to consistently see in a PvP zone. In that sense, you might consider nightmare dungeons to be the best legendary and gold per hour. However, there are a lot of factors to consider. Helltides do look like the worst option out of the 3, but they do allow you to farm for important crafting materials and for you to target farm specific pieces of gear. So if you're looking for a specific aspect that might only spawn on rings, for example, you might prefer to go to helltides to farm, even if it gives less legendaries per hour. The PvP zones also allow you to target farm for your gear, but not to the same extent as helltides, as you can only gamble for armor pieces and not any of the jewelry or weapons. Your farming might also be broken up by sporadic duels from other players, which could be a good or a bad thing depending on the type of person you are. And of course, nightmare dungeons do provide glyph XP, which you can't get anywhere else. So I'm not here to tell you which is exactly the best place. I just want to be here to provide you guys with the numbers from my own experiment so you guys can make a better decision on where to farm in Diablo 4. And for me as a PvPer, it's just nice to know that PvP isn't that far off when it comes to efficiency in farming for legendaries and gold. And if you like PvP and you want to get better at it, then make sure you check out this video.